Before the dawn of January 31st, 1968, Hue was the most beautiful city in Vietnam. It was the Imperial City, the ancient capital of the Nguyen dynasty. It was a city of scholars, poets, and serene Buddhist pagodas sitting along the banks of the Perfume River. For the Americans fighting the war, Hue was a sanctuary. It was considered off-limits. The war raged in the jungles and the rice paddies, but Hue was unspoken neutral ground, protected by its history and its cultural significance. If you were stationed in Hue, you felt lucky. You slept in a real bed, you ate real food, and you didn't worry about tripwires on the sidewalk. It was Tet, the Lunar New Year, the most sacred holiday in Vietnam. A time for families, ancestors, and fireworks. A unilateral ceasefire had been declared. The war was supposed to take a holiday. The mood in the city on January 30th was festive. The markets were crowded. People were buying flowers and rice cakes. The air smelled of incense and anticipation. At the MACV compound, the small American Military Assistance Command located on the south bank of the river, the handful of Marines and Army advisors were relaxing. They were watching movies, writing letters, maybe drinking a contraband beer. The guard towers were manned, but the tension was low. The biggest threat seemed to be a hangover from the Tet celebrations. Nobody knew that beneath the noise of the firecrackers, an army was moving. Nobody knew that the thousands of civilians pouring into the city for the holiday included entire battalions of North Vietnamese Army, NVA regulars, and Viet Cong, VC guerrillas, dressed in plain clothes, their weapons smuggled in under baskets of fruit and flowers. They had been planning this for months. They had infiltrated the city, mapped out every street, every government building, every police station. They had prepositioned weapon caches in pagodas and private homes. While the Americans slept, believing in the truce, the noose was already around the neck of the city. The illusion shattered at 03:40 a.m. on January 31st. The sound of fireworks changed. The cheerful pop-pop-pop of celebrations was replaced by the sickening crump-crump-crump of 120 mm rockets slamming into the city. Mortar rounds began to rain down on the MACV compound. The initial reaction wasn't panic, it was confusion. Who is firing? It's Tet. There's a truce. Then the ground assault began. 8,000 enemy soldiers emerged from the shadows simultaneously. They struck every major target in the city. The police stations were overrun in minutes. The prison was thrown open, and thousands of inmates were armed. The provincial headquarters was stormed. Within 4 hours, the entire city of Hue, the third largest city in South Vietnam, belonged to the communists, except for 2 tiny besieged islands. On the north bank of the river, inside the massive stone walls of the ancient citadel, the ARVN 1st Division headquarters was holding out by a thread. On the south bank, in the new city, the American MACV compound was surrounded. We were a handful of clerks, truck drivers, and military police, suddenly facing hardened NVA regulars screaming for our blood. We manned the bunkers on the perimeter wall, firing into the darkness until the barrels of our M16s glowed red. We could hear them just outside the wire, shouting, blowing whistles, setting up heavy machine guns in the buildings across the street. When the sun rose on that first morning, the beautiful city of Hue was gone. Smoke billowed from 100 fires, hanging low under the thick gray monsoon clouds. The streets were littered with bodies, civilians caught in the crossfire, policemen executed on their doorsteps. And flying high above the massive flagpole in the citadel, visible to the entire city, was a gigantic gold-starred blue and red Viet Cong flag. It was a shock to the system. The enemy wasn't just hiding in the jungle anymore. They had taken a major city, and they were daring us to come and take it back. The calls for help went out. Hue is under heavy attack. We are surrounded. Send reinforcements. The response from high command was skeptical. It's probably just a large raid. They won't stay. They were wrong. The NVA had come to stay. They had dug in. They had turned every stone house into a bunker, every window into a sniper nest. The battle for Hue had begun, and the young Marines who were rushed toward the city on trucks, expecting a quick cleanup operation, had no idea they were driving straight into the worst meat grinder of the Vietnam War. The first reinforcements to reach Hue were elements of the 1st Marine Division, specifically Alpha and Bravo companies of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, 1 Cart 1. They rolled toward the city on trucks, down Route 1, thinking they were responding to a minor skirmish. They were jungle fighters. They were trained to fight in the elephant grass and the bamboo thickets. They knew how to spot a booby trap on a dirt trail. They knew how to call in artillery on a tree line. They knew absolutely nothing about fighting in a city. As their convoy approached the southern suburbs of Hue, they were hit. A wall of fire erupted from the houses lining the road. RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, slammed into the lead trucks. Machine gun fire shredded the canvas covers of the transports. Marines dove out of the trucks into the ditches, confused and pinned down. Where was the enemy? They weren't behind trees. They were inside houses. They were on rooftops. They were firing from sewer grates. This was a three-dimensional battlefield. In the jungle, you mostly worried about what was in front of you. In Hue, death could come from above, from below, and from any of the four cardinal directions simultaneously. The Marines fought their way to the besieged MACV compound, taking heavy casualties just to get inside the gate. Once there, they realized the magnitude of the situation. They weren't just fighting a few guerrillas. They were facing fully equipped NVA regiments who had had days to prepare kill zones. The order came down: clear the city block by block. It sounded simple on a map. In reality, it was a nightmare. A city block in Hue was a fortress. The houses were built of stone and concrete, packed tightly together. The streets were narrow. The weather turned against us. The northeast monsoon settled over the city. A cold, miserable, ceaseless rain began to fall. The temperature dropped into the 50s. We were soaked to the bone, shivering in the mud and the rubble. The low clouds meant no air support. No phantoms dropping napalm. No skyhawks with bombs. We were on our own. It was infantry against infantry, eye to eye, at point-blank range. The learning curve was vertical, and it was written in blood. The Marines learned quickly that walking down the middle of a street was suicide. NVA snipers were positioned in high church towers and upper-story windows, picking men off one by one. You wouldn't hear the shot. You'd just see the guy in front of you drop with a hole in his head. They learned that doors were booby-trapped. Windows were kill zones. So they adapted. They stopped using doors. They learned to mouse hole. To take a block of houses, you didn't go outside. You started at the first house, blew a hole in the wall with C4 or a rocket launcher, stepped through into the next living room, cleared it with grenades and M16s, and then blew a hole in the next wall. They fought from living room to kitchen, from bedroom to hallway. It was brutal, intimate violence. You were fighting in people's homes. You were taking cover behind their sofas, stepping over their family photos, firing your machine gun from their dining table. The noise inside those concrete houses was indescribable. The concussion of grenades thrown into small rooms made your ears bleed. The air was thick with pulverized concrete dust, smoke, and the smell of cordite and death. Every advance was measured in inches and paid for in lives. A squad would stack up outside a building. The point man would kick the door, throw a frag grenade, and rush in firing. Sometimes they found an empty room. Sometimes they found a heavy machine gun nest waiting for them. The casualties were horrendous. Platoons that started the day with 45 men would end it with 15 effective fighters. Corpsmen, the Navy medics, were dying trying to save the wounded in the open streets. The NVA fought with incredible tenacity. They held every room until they were killed or blasted out. They used spider holes connected by tunnels to pop up behind the Marines who had just cleared an area. By the end of the first week, the southern part of the city, the modern part, was a ruin of twisted metal and broken concrete. The Marines had retaken it, house by agonizing house. But across the Perfume River, looming over the destruction, stood the real objective. The Citadel, the ancient fortress of the emperors, the heart of the enemy's resistance, and the NVA flag was still flying over it, mocking us in the cold rain. Retaking the South Bank was hell. But crossing the Perfume River to get to the Citadel was suicide. The river separated the modern city from the ancient fortress. Spanning it was the Nguyen Huang Bridge, Truong Tien Bridge, a long steel structure. The NVA held the North Bank. They had set up heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and B-40 rocket teams in the bunkers along the waterfront and in the towers of the Citadel walls. They had the bridge completely zeroed. Anything that moved on that bridge was instantly vaporized. The Marines tried to cross. They sent tanks, the massive M48 Pattons, to lead the way. As the lead tank clattered onto the bridge deck, the far bank erupted. A dozen rockets hit the tank simultaneously. It turned into a burning coffin. The crew inside didn't have a chance. The infantry trying to follow behind the tanks were cut down by grazing machine gun fire that swept the bridge deck like a scythe. It was a shooting gallery, and we were the targets. After several disastrous attempts, the NVA blew the bridge. The center span collapsed into the gray water of the Perfume River with a groan of twisting steel. Now, we were truly cut off from the Citadel. The only way across was by boat, under fire. We used landing craft, LCUs and LCMs, borrowed from the Navy, to ferry troops and supplies across the river under the cloak of darkness or smokescreens. It felt like a miniature D-Day every time a boat pushed off the bank. The water around the boats would boil with machine gun bullets and mortar shrapnel. We sat low in the steel hulls, listening to the metal pinging from the impacts, praying the engine wouldn't die. Once on the north bank, we faced the Citadel itself. It was an intimidating sight. A massive fortress built in the early 1800s, modeled after the Forbidden City in Beijing. The outer walls were 30 feet high, up to 40 feet thick, made of stone and packed earth, surrounded by a zigzagging moat. It was built to withstand medieval siege engines, but it proved remarkably resistant to modern weaponry. Our artillery shells just bounced off the thick sloped walls. Mortars barely scratched the surface. The NVA were dug deep into these walls. They had created a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers inside the historic ramparts. They fired from arrow slits that were centuries old. The Marines were joined by South Vietnamese Rangers and airborne units, who had been fighting desperately inside the northeast corner of the Citadel since day one. The fighting here made the South Bank look like a skirmish. This was siege warfare, medieval style, but with 20th century weapons. The primary weapon for breaking the walls became the M50 Ontos. It was a strange-looking little tracked vehicle, ugly as sin, armed with 6 100 cm recoilless rifles. The Marines loved it. The Ontos would creep up to a fortified position in the wall, fire all 6 rifles at once, a devastating salvo of high-explosive plastic rounds, and blow a breach in the stone. Then the infantry would pour through the gap. The battle for the Citadel walls was ferocious. It was fought at ranges of 10 feet. Marines used flamethrowers to burn the NVA out of the bunkers. They used tear gas, CS gas, in massive quantities, trying to flush them out of the tunnels. The gas hung thick in the wet air, burning eyes and lungs, forcing everyone to fight in gas masks, adding to the misery of the cold rain. Every time we took a section of the wall, the NVA would counterattack at night. They would swarm out of their spider holes, throwing satchel charges, screaming, trying to push us back into the moat. We slept in the mud among the ancient cannons, afraid to close our eyes. The nights were lit by the eerie, flickering light of illumination flares dropping slowly under parachutes, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like attackers. We were grinding forward, yard by yard, paying a butcher's bill for every foot of historic ground. And we hadn't even reached the Imperial Palace yet. By mid-February, after 2 weeks of the most intense combat of the war, we finally breached the outer walls and entered the Citadel proper. We thought the worst was over. We were wrong. Inside the walls was another city, a maze of narrow alleys, ancient temples, gardens, and imperial residences. And in the very center, surrounded by yet another high wall, was the Imperial Palace, the purple Forbidden City, where the emperors used to live. The fighting moved from the stone ramparts into this sacred ground. It was surreal and heartbreaking. We were fighting amidst national treasures. Artillery shells crashed into pagodas that had stood for centuries, turning intricately carved mahogany into splinters. Tanks rolled through ancient ornamental gardens, crushing delicate porcelain statues under their treads. Napalm burned down historic archives. The rules of engagement, which had tried to protect the city's architecture early in the battle, were completely gone. The NVA were using the temples as bunkers, so the temples had to be destroyed. It was a cultural tragedy, and we were the instruments of destruction. We felt the weight of it, even in the heat of combat. We were erasing history to save a city. But as we pushed deeper into the residential areas of the Citadel, we discovered something far worse than destroyed buildings. We discovered the true darkness of the enemy's occupation. The NVA and VC hadn't just been fighting us. They had been busy purging the city. They had come with lists. Lists of enemies of the people. Government officials, teachers, policemen, priests, nuns, intellectuals. Anyone who had ties to the South Vietnamese government, or anyone who was just educated. They were rounded up in the first days of the occupation. As we cleared the houses and the gardens, we began to find the mass graves. In schoolyards, in dried-up creek beds, behind pagodas, we found them. Dozens of bodies tied together with wire. Some had been shot in the back of the head. Some had been beaten to death. Some, the evidence suggested, had been buried alive. We found whole families. We found priests still in their robes. We found foreign doctors, Germans, French, who had been working at the university hospital, executed for the crime of trying to help the sick. The smell of death in Hue changed. It wasn't just the smell of battlefield casualties anymore. It was the sickening, sweet smell of atrocity. It hardened the Marines. The initial shock turned into a cold, burning rage. The enemy we were fighting weren't soldiers. They were butchers. The combat became even more vicious. There were no more calls for surrender. No prisoners were taken by either side in the final days inside the Citadel. It was a fight to the death in the shadow of the Imperial Palace. The final objective was the Palace of Perfect Peace, the throne room of the Nguyen emperors. The NVA had set up their command post there. The battle for the palace grounds was the climax. It was hand-to-hand fighting in the throne room. Marines flipping tables inlaid with mother-of-pearl to use as cover. Grenades exploding against lacquered pillars. Bullet holes shredding ancient silk tapestries. It was a chaotic, swirling fight amidst the ghosts of emperors. Slowly, room by room, courtyard by courtyard, the superior firepower and sheer stubbornness of the Marines and the ARVN troops pushed the remaining NVA defenders back. They were cornered. They were out of supplies. Their escape routes to the mountains had been cut by U.S. Army cavalry units circling the city. They fought with the desperation of trapped rats. On February 24th, ARVN Rangers finally stormed the southern gate of the Imperial Palace. They fought their way to the main flagpole, the Ngo Mon Gate, where that massive Viet Cong flag had been flying for 25 days, taunting us. At dawn on February 25th, 1968, the guns finally fell silent inside the Citadel. A squad of South Vietnamese soldiers, their uniforms torn, covered in the red dust and grime of 4 weeks of continuous combat, climbed the battered stairs of the Ngo Mon Gate Tower. Under the gray weeping sky, they hauled down the giant Viet Cong flag. It was tattered, bullet-riddled, stained with smoke. Slowly, they raised the yellow and red striped flag of the Republic of South Vietnam. There was no cheering. There was no grand ceremony. The men who watched it happen, Marines and ARVN soldiers alike, were too exhausted, too numb to celebrate. They just leaned against broken walls, smoking cigarettes with shaking hands, staring at the flag with hollow eyes. The Battle of Hue was over, but the victory felt like ashes in our mouths. We looked around at what we had won. Hue, the jewel of Vietnam, was dead. 80% of the city was destroyed or heavily damaged. The modern area on the south bank was a blackened skeleton of concrete. The ancient citadel was a moonscape of craters and shattered stone. The Imperial Palace was a ruin. The cost of retaking the city was astronomical. The Marines and Army units sustained over 1,500 casualties, with 216 killed. The South Vietnamese Army lost nearly 400 killed. The NVA lost an estimated 5,000 men inside the city and surrounding areas. Their best units were decimated, but the true victims were the civilians of Hue. Over 5,800 civilians were dead or missing. Many killed in the crossfire, but thousands executed in cold blood by the communists during their 25-day reign of terror. In the weeks and months that followed, more mass graves were discovered around the city. The final count of the executed reached nearly 3,000 men, women, and children. It was a scar on the soul of Vietnam that would never heal. For the Marines who fought there, Hue changed everything. We went in as jungle fighters. thinking the war was about patrols and ambushes in the boonies. We left as urban warriors, haunted by the intimacy of killing men in their own kitchens, haunted by the smell of mass graves, haunted by the destruction of a beautiful city. We realized then that the war had changed. The enemy was willing to sacrifice everything, their own cities, their own people, to win. General Westmoreland claimed Tet was a massive military defeat for the communists. And tactically, he was right. The NVA lost tens of thousands of men and gained no ground permanently. But strategically, Hue was the beginning of the end for America in Vietnam. The images of the fighting in Hue, Marines pinned down behind tanks in rubble-strewn streets, the Viet Cong flag flying over an American protectorate, the sheer brutality of the urban combat were beamed into living rooms back in the United States every night for a month. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, came to Hue during the battle. He saw the carnage. He saw the stalemate. And he went back on TV and told the American people that the war was unwinnable, that we were mired in a stalemate. When the American people saw Hue destroyed to be saved, something broke in the national will. I remember leaving Hue on a convoy headed back to Phu Bai. I looked back at the city one last time. It was just a smudge of gray smoke against the rainy sky. I thought about the friends I left behind there, zipped into body bags lined up on the muddy ground. We had taken the city back. We had done our duty, but looking at the ruins, I couldn't help but ask the question that would haunt all of us for the rest of our lives. Was it worth it? This has been the story of the Battle of Hue City, the bloodiest, longest, and most defining battle of the Vietnam War. If this story honored the memory of those who fought there, please subscribe and share this video. We must never forget. Semper Fi.